Hello and welcome to another edition of the European Report here in the European Parliament in Brussels. And in today's programme, we're going to be discussing the crisis in the Ukraine and asking the question, is this situation about to deteriorate as we've seen that Russia has moved her troops into the Crimean? Also saying what impact will this have on the Jewish community in the Ukraine and Russia? And also in this programme, we'll be having an update on the EU guidelines, which is threatening Israeli relations with the EU, and also Denmark's decision to ban the ritual slaughter of food, which has huge implications for the Jewish community in Denmark. And in today's programme, I'm joined by Joel Rosenfeld, who is the Vice Chairman of the European Parliament here in Brussels. So welcome to the programme. And we have our first rabbi on the European Report, Rabbi Menachem Margolin, who's the Director General of European Jewish Associations, and Thomas Sandel, who's very well known on the European Report, the founder and executive director of the European Coalition for Israel, and good friend Andrew Tucker, who's also the with the European Coalition for Israel. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Joel, can you explain how you got involved in Jewish advocacy? You were also once the leader of the Jewish community here in Belgium, and how you are now the vice chairman of the Jewish Parliament here in Brussels.
Well, it's just about facts. Being Jew today in Belgium and actually in Europe is more difficult than 15 years ago. In 2000, in September 2000, there was the outbreak of the Second Intifada, and the days after, in Brussels, in Paris, in London, in Berlin, and other main Western European cities, rabbis were attacked because they are Jews. And so there was a huge increase of anti-Semitism following this outbreak of the Intifada. We have to fight back. We have to fight back. And all the facts and figures that we have from official institutions here in Belgium or also from European institutions testify about this degradation of the situation for Jews in Europe. A few months ago, in October 2013, there was the report, the survey from the Fundamental Rights Agency about the feelings of Jews in Europe. And we see that, for instance, in Belgium, the study focused on 8 European countries, gathering 90% of the European Jewish community. Among them, it was Belgium, and we see that, for instance, in Belgium, 28% of the people who answered to this survey said that they were victims of anti-Semitism those last 12 months. It's huge. 41% of those same people are thinking about emigrating. Come on, until 2000, I saw that this kind of figures and this kind of feelings, I will just find this back in history books. And today it's news. It happens in our countries. And behind this, we have to keep in mind that anti-Semitism is a threat for Jews, but actually it goes far beyond. It's a threat for all the Western European civilization, for the Judeo-Christian values of Europe, and it's a threat actually to the very basic principle of European democracy.
Yeah. And Rabbi Menachem, it's a great honour to have a rabbi on the European Report, so you're the first rabbi we had on the programme. Can you share something to our viewers about your background, the training that you went through to become a rabbi, and the very important work that you're doing now?
To become a rabbi, there's a few things have to be done. First of all, you need to study to be a rabbi. There's a lot of laws, as you may know, about Jewish religious. But there is then a rabbi of community who just serves as a rabbi and answers questions when talking about Jewish laws. And we look at it as the rabbi also should be a leader when it's needed. According to Jewish custom, when any person actually sees that there is a need for anything and no one is there to take the role, he should do it. For this reason, we never agreed that Jewish organization or anyone who would like to do a positive action should be elected by anyone, because anyone who have an intention to do something positive should just go and do it. We active in Brussels for the past 14 years, We started, actually, I joined 4 years later. I'm here in Brussels for the past 10 years. There are 3 fields that we operate in Europe. The first one is to redevelop Jewish life in Europe, following what my dear colleague, Mr. Rubenfeld, just said. In Europe, we see today that about 50% of Jewish people in Europe don't want anyone to know that they are Jews. They are afraid because they feel threatened to be Jews. So for us, this is a huge number. There's about 70 to 75% of Jewish people in Europe who don't have any public relationship with the Jewish communities, because they're afraid to be connected with Judaism in public, and because, unfortunately, for a very long time, they did not know anything about Jewish communities. The fact that most of Jewish communities in Europe have been destroyed during the Holocaust time, many of them did not build it themselves. So for this reason, many communities in Europe was not functioning in the ways that people will be attracted to be in touch with the community. So we understood that one of the things we should do is to develop a lot of educational program, and not only, in order to make the communities more attractive for people to come and to join the community, to feel again proud to be Jews. The second field we do is anything related to protect Jewish rights in Europe. This is said, again, following what Mr. Rubenfeld just said, that 2014 we are still in a position where we should protect our rights, but unfortunately, especially even in the past 2 years, the way of the style of anti-Semitism of today, as we look at it, is not only again on the street when people attacked. I see it on a daily basis when people can look at me and say things that I prefer my children not to hear. However, today we see a campaign against Jewish tradition. A campaign, I mean, that the authorities, again, to convince people to kill other people, this is not so easy task, because people have been educated as a normal people. And then you want to ask them to kill other people is something very, very strange. But the way to do it is to do a huge campaign before, to explain people why it should be done. For example, if you will educate your child that if he see a robber, he should kill him, because the robbers are the most terrible thing for the future of the world, the child will grow up and he will understand that the robbers must be killed. So if a campaign against Jewish tradition, Jewish customs, and people got educated, the Jewish customs is something that belonged to 2,000 years ago, and the people of today does not belong to this world, and actually is problematic for the future of the world, then people got educated. And in the past years, we see a campaign against Jewish customs, against circumcision, against ritual slaughter, against other things, which we truly believe that in the past it led to a terrible situation. It can be the same today. So we focus on this field as well.
Excellent, which is really good. And Andrew, Tucker, can you give us an update on some of the very important work that you've been doing recently?
Okay. Well, Simon, one of the things that we're focusing on as the European Coalition for Israel is defending and actually advocating Israel's rights in international diplomacy. So we're very much focused on the BDS issue, the boycott, divestment and sanctions issue, and the whole ream of things which are happening in Europe, whereby European Union, but also a number of the member states, are promoting or at least supporting the boycott of Israel. And it's all under the guise of international law. So we've got a project we're working on very much to advocate towards the European Union against the guidelines which were published last July to stop European funding of settlements. And we're finding that is going very much to the heart of the support of Israel. So we have an open letter which we are about to present to the High Representative Catherine Ashton, which we're putting the case for why these guidelines are not a good thing. And we have almost 50 members of Parliament and other former and current politicians in Europe who've signed the letter. And it's simply to say this is not only discriminatory, but it is also going to the heart of Europe's relations with Israel. Instead of encouraging a positive relationship with Israel, Europe is encouraging or fostering this sort of atmosphere of encouraging businesses, major institutions, to withdraw from investing in Israel. This is the wrong signal to be sending. And the underlying issue, I think, is to show that the relationship that Israel has with Europe is fundamental to Europe's identity. And I think it relates to this issue in the Ukraine, for example. Europe needs to understand that its identity lies in its Judeo-Christian values, which are at its root are Judeo values. Europe belongs with Israel, Israel belongs with Europe, and the two are inseparable.
And Thomas, I know that you're very much always involved in very interesting work, but in particular the work of raising awareness of Raoul Wallenberg and what happened to him after he was really taken hostage by the Soviets after World War II. Can you give us a little bit of an update on this campaign and why it's so important to the Wallenberg family and also for one of the great heroes of World War II?
Well, I think it's interesting you bring up Raoul Wallenberg because I know that we have a very strong and a good Jewish representation on this program, but also the Christian side here. And this is really the way it should be. We should be working hand in hand together. Also to say that when we started this coalition, European Coalition for Israel, it was precisely because it was only the Jewish communities at the time that were reacting against the rise of anti-Semitism. This was back in 2001, 2, and 3. And Elie Wiesel was speaking at that time, and he said, well, where are all the others? Meaning the Christians, the agnostics, and humanists, and this and that. And we want to be this coalition of all the others. So it's such an honor to be here together with you and be engaged in this fight together with you. Because that brings us really to Raoul Wallenberg. He was not Jewish, at least not that what we would traditionally define as Jewish, but he cared about the situation, the plight of the Jewish people in Budapest at the time, and he did something about it. Again, he was a man of privilege and wealth, so he had no reason to get involved in what some may consider a conflict far away from Stockholm. But nevertheless, there was something in him that realized that this was wrong, and he had to use all the resources, all his giftings, to do something. And what he did is history today, that he saved tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews out of Budapest through these Swedish passports, fake passports actually. And this is what we like to do. You know, some people, and I often hear this said to me, that, you know, why do you bother? You know, we should try to distance ourselves a little bit from the Jewish communities, because if we get involved, that means that we will have trouble. And sadly, it may come a time when we will be in just as much trouble as the Jewish communities are today. But I think that's where we ought to be if that is the fate and the destiny. So with Raoul Wallenberg, as you know, it has almost passed 70 years since his disappearance. When the Russians came into Budapest, and he was captured by the Russians together with his driver, and nothing has been heard about his fate after that date. So what the family is asking, and I'm very privileged to be connected with the family today, is simply that the Russian archives should be opened up so that independent researchers can come in and determine once and for all what happened. And it so happens today that in an hour or so I'll have the great privilege to attend a luncheon and ceremony with the President of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso, who will receive an award from the Raoul Wallenberg Foundation. And later in the afternoon we have a meeting with the Russian ambassador to the European Union, again to raise this question on and on again. Please, can you tell us how we can have access to the Russian archives? And this is something that we do also in honor of those people, righteous Gentiles, who laid down their lives to save Jews, something that all of us all of the Christians should have done in the 30s and the 40s. But I believe I speak also on behalf of Andrew that we feel very privileged that we can be together with you in this battle today.
Absolutely, and we all are together. The main issue we're discussing today is the situation in the Ukraine, and you know, what began in the Ukraine with the demonstrations against the former president Viktor Yanukovych, abandoning closer ties with the European Union, embracing closer ties with Russia, has now developed into a full diplomatic and military crisis. Joel, the British Foreign Secretary William Hague only said yesterday that the crisis in the Ukraine with Russia is the biggest crisis that the international community have faced in the 21st century, as Russian forces have moved in to the Crimea. What is your take on the situation?
Well, I think that it can become the biggest crisis. Today, we don't know exactly what's going on. We know that there are Russian military in Crimea, but actually they have the right to be there according to the agreement between Ukraine and Russia. But they cannot go in the street and take the power, and apparently that's what's going on. So it's very difficult because each day the situation is changing. We don't know until which point the Russian will go. But of course, Russia is taking profit of the weakness of Europe and actually also the weakness of US today. We see that, let's say that it's a showdown. Ukraine today, it's the place of a showdown between US and Russia. Europe is in between, but it's mainly a showdown between US and Russia. We know also that President Obama, unfortunately, is tough with its allies, one of them Israel, of course, and is weak with his enemies. So I'm not very confident about the strength of Europe and US on this issue. But what we see is that Russia is trying to take profit of this situation to probably annexate Crimea and maybe to divide Ukraine in two parts, because we all know that Ukraine is divided between a pro-Western part and pro-Russian part. But even on this topic, the situation has changed those last days. You know, there are some differences between the pro-Yanukovych and the anti-Yanukovych camps in Ukraine. But today, since Russia tried to take over Crimea, it brings all the Ukrainian people together against Russia. So I hope that the Ukrainian people will be strong enough to resist against the Russian aggression. And I hope also that we, Europe, and that the US will show concretely, with concrete measures, its support to the Ukrainian people will to self-determination and to decide on his own fate. Actually, I'm supportive of the will of the Ukrainian people to get closer to Europe, because that's the right of the Ukrainian people to have more democracy and to determine by themselves their fate. But we have to take everything in account, and one thing that we have to take in account, it's also the fate of the Jewish community.
Absolutely.
That's very concerning today. You know, the situation, again, on this specific topic is much more nuanced than one we can read in the media. My co-chairman is Ukrainian. Vadim Rabinovich is also president of Jewish community in Ukraine. So I have regular contact with him, and I'm updated regularly on the situation on the ground. What Vadim Rabinovich tells me is that today there is no anti-Semitism in Ukraine. Of course, there are anti-Semitic attacks, but we cannot say that Ukraine is an anti-Semitic country. Come on, in Belgium, in France, in England, in every unfortunately, in every European countries, synagogues are vandalized, Jewish cemeteries are vandalized, and Jews are attacked in the street. Let's say that in Ukraine, the level is lower than in other democratic European countries on this specific fact. What we can see also is that the acting Ukraine leader, Prime Minister President Tuchinov, he pledged a few days ago that, I quote him, he would do everything in his power to protect the country's Jewish community. So what we witnessed also is that a few days ago during the protest, the violent protest, which have mobilized self-defense patrols, actually they've cooperated with local Jewish community to make sure Jewish sites are protected. So, you know, we need to have the global picture, and we need to take also in account that Russian propaganda is trying to use anti-Semitism to gather support internationally. So the situation today is very complex. What I can tell you is that today, I'm not speaking about tomorrow, but today, there is no reason to worry, to overreact, or to be over-concerned by anti-Semitism in Ukraine, but we need to be very careful about what's going on tomorrow. And that's also the role of the European authorities to support and to accompany the Ukrainian leaders on the good path. Because even in Ukraine, you have extremists, you have fascist party like Pravi sector, like Svoboda. They are trying to take profit of this situation to gain more power. But till now, those extremist parties, they gather 10% of the vote in Ukraine. 10% for extremist party. In each European country, we have this level, even more in France or other European countries. So let's follow this situation very carefully, and we urge the European authorities to give all the necessary, all the needed support to the current Ukrainian authorities to put them on the good path of democracy. And one of the strengths of the democracy is its ability to protect its minorities.
Yeah, and Thomas, I want to bring you on this one. According to the Daily Mail, Britain and the US could be dragged into this war to defend Ukraine because of part of a treaty signed called the Budapest Memorandum, which was signed in 1994 to protect Ukrainian sovereignty if she's attacked. And with the likelihood of over 150,000 Russian troops on the borders of the Ukraine, do you think we could be heading for war?
Well, I think this is exactly the same question that each one of us and millions of us in Europe and Russia and Ukraine have been asking ourselves this morning. And as this is being recorded, I think there's a timeline which is expiring in just in a few hours from the Russian side. Anything could happen, and I think that's the first point I want to make, because there was a time when anything to do with the Cold War was being dismissed. And I recall even the US presidential debate between Obama and Mitt Romney, when I think Sarah Palin, even before that, when they were asked to name the biggest threat to peace to the United States, and the Republicans, they said, well, Russia. And this was being ridiculed. They said, well, I'm sorry, but don't you know that the Cold War is over? It's 20 years past. And I think it only shows that the intelligence service and the political elite in the US and in the Western world did misread geopolitics. You know, the Cold War is here again, no matter how it will eventually play out, and we better be on our alert. Second point and concluding remark on this issue, because it's not for me to speculate whether there will be war or not. I don't think so, and certainly I pray that this will not be the case. But I think, as Joel said, I think it was that the Western community, you know, led by the US president, has been rather weak and inconsistent in his so-called red lines. We saw it in Georgia. We saw it in Syria. And of course, the Russians have been watching. They're not stupid. Of course, they're watching whether each move the U.S. administration is taking. They're watching. They're learning from it. And obviously, they knew that they could make this move with little or limited repercussions from the Western world. That is not to say that the price would not be high, could eventually be disastrous economically for Russia if they take this next move, but they also know that there are very clear limitations to what the Western world will do, sadly.
Yeah, and Andrew, you have representatives on the ground in Ukraine, haven't you? Because you're doing a great work, your organisation, in helping Jewish people make Aliyah, and obviously that situation now is becoming a little bit more desperate and very precarious. Can you give us an update on the situation on the ground with the people that you work for, with Christians for Israel in Holland, and the people you work with in the Ukraine?
Yeah, so we have a small team that's been working very closely with the Jewish Agency, particularly over the last 5 or 10 years, to support and help the Jewish communities in the Ukraine that want to make Aliyah, that want to return to Israel, to be able to do so. And the kind of information that we're getting is, just to pick up on Joel's point, I think the Jewish community in the Ukraine, we're talking, as I understand it, around 300,000 Jewish people who are entitled, eligible to make Aliyah under the law of return. So through the Jewish Agency, they are entitled to return to Israel should they want to. But politically, they're in a very, very difficult and complex position. They don't want to create unrest. They don't want to create problems. On the other hand, I think there's a growing awareness that if things escalate, then the Jewish community are going to be at the very forefront of the conflict. And we know that from history, that it's often the Jews who are given the greatest amount of attention and guilt in a conflict situation. So what we're trying to do is, again, gently to help the Jewish people to at least be in a position where they can make the return to Israel when the time comes. So there's a whole process whereby a Jewish person in the Ukraine needs to have his or her paperwork in order, needs to obtain an appropriate international visa from the Ukrainian authorities, which has to be supported by Israel. And at that point, they're able to be moved or to move. So we feel we're in a crisis situation where things could escalate. We don't want to be preemptive. We don't want to be scaremongers. At the same time, we do feel very much that the Jewish people in Ukraine need to be ready. So that's what we're trying to do on the ground. I think security is important. I think protection is important. But looking to tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, we need to be prepared today.
Yeah, and Rabbi, can you maybe give us a bit of an insight into the plight of the Jewish community in Ukraine at the moment, their fears, their concerns, and how we can, show them our support?
First of all, I agree with what my colleague just said about the level of anti-Semitism in Ukraine. I can say that the Jewish community in Ukraine live for a very long time in a full freedom of religion, with almost minimum number of anti-Semitism attacks. They have great security. They have a great relationship with the government. They had. So I can say the Jewish community in Ukraine had very good time. We're talking about anti-Semitism point of view. At the same time, I say about Jewish community in Russia. In Russia, there's almost no anti-Semitism attacks. There's a great relationship between the government and Jewish communities. And again, in both countries, the Jewish community had very good time. So I don't really think that Jewish communities in Ukraine are part of this conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And I don't think the Jewish community even wants to give an opinion about that, because they're waiting, as everybody do, to see what will be the results of this conflict. For sure, everybody pray that this conflict will reach the end for the benefit of both sides and for the benefit of the citizens of Ukraine and the Jewish communities among them. However, again, at the beginning of the revolution, we were concerned about anti-Semite attacks in Ukraine. But it was clear that it is not an increasing of anti-Semitism in Ukraine, but is mainly because the government are busy, the authorities were busy with the I would say the big picture of the conflict. So different people in the street, it could be just vandalism, and people just saw that there's no security, so they reacted, but not because of a level of anti-Semitism. We approach also the European Union, the US government, the Israeli government. Actually, I asked last week Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to send guards to protect Jewish communities in Ukraine, because we realized that in those few days it was a lack of security, a lack of understanding of the situation. However, as of today, it looks like the situation came back again to normal, and in the past days we did not hear about any attacks or any problems of Jewish communities, and not only now the authorities helps the Jewish communities in any matter they need. So again, I don't think the Jewish communities have any opinion about the results or the end of this conflict, but just pray for the end.
Absolutely. We've just had Thomas Sandel had to leave us because he's got a meeting to do with Raoul Wallenberg, which is very important. So he's left the European report now, and this is what happens here in the European Parliament. Joe, I want to ask you in particular, are we seeing the rise of Russian aggression again against Europe, primarily because of a lack of American leadership in the world? And the reference I give was last September, when President Obama gave clear red guidelines to the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad not to use chemical, biological weapons against his own people. And the regime went beyond those red lines, and we saw no response on behalf of the American government in terms of military intervention. Do you think this is what we're seeing, a lack of American leadership in the world and leadership in the West that is giving dictators like Putin that power to push the West as far as he can? And this is what we're seeing in the Crimea and the Ukraine now.
Obviously, the way US dealt with the Syrian crisis and with the red line of the chemical weapon use, it was shameful, and it was diplomatically a catastrophe, because it gave a green light to all tyrants of the world, from Iran to North Korea and to Vladimir Putin. It gave them the green line to do what they want, because they know that what we are used to call the leader of the free world, United States, during the 20th century, they safeguard the liberties of all the free world. Today, with the leadership of President Obama, we are not sure anymore that they will be able to deliver this promise. And indeed, today, President Putin, who is a smart guy and who is also a cynical guy, knows that he is not taking too much risk to go to Crimea, because, first of all, Europe is weak. Militarily speaking, there is no European Union, militarily speaking, and US today is also weak. And Russia, we know from the history that when they do something, they are doing it till the end. And today there is no dissuasive power regarding the Russian aggression. And speaking about Ukraine, militarily speaking, Ukraine is also weak compared to Russia. So I don't know what will happen tomorrow, but it will be a political and moral fault for Europe and for US not to support Ukraine, because they supported the protest in Ukraine. Probably some in Europe and US even incited those protests and this revolution. Today, they need to deliver. They need to, you cannot abandon Ukrainian people after supporting them during months for the quest to freedom. So I don't know where, until which point Vladimir Putin will be able to go, but Europe and US have to let understand to President Putin that they will not throw under the bus Ukraine, and there are diplomatic and also economic leverage to let this know to Russia. And the G8 summit now, which has to be held in Sochi, I heard that US will not go, maybe other countries will not go, and I think the G7 has to send a strong signal to Russia that they can go back to G7 and to expel Russia from G8. Actually, that's it. It's one leverage, but there has to be other leverage exerted on Russia today, hic et nunc, today, now, and not tomorrow.
Yeah. Rabbi Menachem, do you think we have a problem in terms of our foreign policy in the West, that we've moved so far away from our Judean-Christian heritage and our understanding, that our policies that are being pursued by the EU, that of the American government, also the British government, are really in a state of confusion, and we're seeing a lack of morality, of standing by not standing with the oppressed, not standing for those who are really fighting for their liberty and freedom, but seem to be indifferent to the rise of evil that we're seeing around the world?
First of all, as I said, we're speaking again about Russia and Ukraine. I think that as a representative of Jewish organization, represent also many Jewish communities in those countries. I don't think that, again, this is a Jewish problem. So the situation is very sensitive. So I clearly don't want to speak about the situation between Russia and Ukraine these days. We're talking in general about the role of the European Union today, the United States. As you mentioned before, this is a bit weird that while in the past 2-3 years there are almost 300,000 people died in Syria, and in the 65 years since the establishment of the State of Israel, there are maybe 20,000 people, Israeli people, died. I don't know how many Arabs have been dying in the war, but there's no doubt it's even not comparable to the amount of people who were dying in Syria. So if talking about 2-3 years, so many people were dying compared to 65 years, how many people were dying, and still the United States and the European Union sometimes are very strong with Israel. Something does not make a real sense here. And we do feel that right after the Holocaust, people in Europe and the government felt bad about the situation, and they showed more, I would say, more understanding towards Jewish needs. And as far as time go by, I think that people start to forget the history and start again to behave not according to the justice.
And the other issue we're going to look at in today's European report is the decision made by the government of Denmark to stop the ritual slaughter of animals that is used in kosher food and also by the Islamic community in halal food. And Rabbi Menachem, you are one of the experts in this issue. Are you concerned about what Denmark is doing and what is the implications for not only the Jewish community in Denmark, but also for the Jewish community across Europe if other governments decide to ban this ritual slaughter of animals that's used for kosher food?
This issue is a very emotional issue for Jewish communities. The reason is that for over 3,000 years since the establishment of the Jewish nation, is almost every year or two in some corner in the world, some groups start a campaign against Jewish ritual slaughter or circumcision. In the past, it led to terrible things. As I mentioned at the beginning, one of the first laws that Hitler made in Europe was to ban ritual slaughter. So if for Jewish people, even for those who do not eat kosher, to hear again about ban against ritual slaughter, it reminds a very terrible situation. So this is a very emotional thing for Jewish people. Unfortunately, a few years ago we had some problem in Holland, but there we succeeded to reach an agreement with the government, and now it's allowed again. We face the same problem in Poland, where the parliament accepted the law to ban ritual slaughter on July, and since then we're in fight with the government, which actually the government asked us to go via the Constitutional Tribunal, as this decision actually is against another Polish law of freedom of religion, which is again also against the European law. And while we're waiting for the decision of the tribunal, we also asked the ombudsman of Poland, and she accepted our claim, and she issued a legal statement to the Prime Minister of Poland that he should act and change the law. When talking about Denmark, there is already for 10 years no kosher slaughter in Denmark. So there's no implication for tomorrow to Denmark. However, that's one of the things that made us a bit worried about the situation, because first of all, in Europe you have a domino effect. Anything that happens in one country very easily go to another countries. Second, the statement that the Minister of Agriculture gave after the decision is that freedom of religion is not more important than animal welfare. Now, for us, this is a big scandal. However, he already apologized. Last week, he met with the president, the Rabbi of the community in Denmark, and apologized. The problem is that we cannot say that all over the only reason for this ban is because of animal welfare, and I will explain why. First of all, in Europe today, there's a lot of problems with animal welfare. You have a problem with the quality of food. You have a problem with the amount of how many square meters each cow have. With the feeding, you have a problem with the transportation. You have a problem with the medicine. You have a lot of problems with control to all animals in Europe. Now, in Europe, you have 800 people lives, including in the continent. Among these 800 million, you have 3 million Jews, which among them you have maybe 300,000 to eat kosher food. You're talking about 0.003% of people in Europe who eat kosher meat. Now, to ban ritual slaughter, which is concerned 0.003%, why there's a problem with concern to 100% of the animals, does not make any sense. I would agree if those who fight for animal welfare will fight for animal welfare and leave the end for the end. And among them, there's a lot of proofs done by many veterinaries and according to many experts that the Jewish way of ritual slaughter is the most human way to kill animals. It's something that's already proved many times by many experts, and actually it's part of European law as well, that that religious group can continue with ritual slaughter. So this decision of Danish minister is against European law, which European law also were accepted by all European countries, including Denmark. And this is a huge problem for Jewish community, although there's no implication for the day after in Denmark.
And Andrew, if we look at Danish history, certainly going back to World War II, incredible actions on behalf of the Danish king to rescue the Danish Jewish population during World War II, during the invasion of the Nazis by the king ordered all the Danish people to wear a yellow star in solidarity with the Jewish people. And yet today we're really seeing how this law, if it's implemented, threatens the very survival of the Jewish community in Belgium. And surely this is a serious concern, not only for us, but also for the future of the Jewish community across Europe.
Yeah. Well, I'd agree with the Rabbi that this what's happening here in Denmark is just, again, another signal which is really a European problem. This issue is still on the table. I live in the Netherlands, and I saw the issue coming up in the last couple of years and being dealt with. Again, a country, the Netherlands, which has a history of being open and tolerant towards the Jewish people, you know, receiving the Jewish people in when they were expelled from Spain and the United Kingdom. But it's almost like this principle of tolerance and freedom is being turned on its head. And now being used against the Jewish people again, whereby freedom of religion is becoming something which, I mean, the very thought that it could be even equated with the sort of animal welfare rights is, to me, bizarre in Europe. This should be one of our most precious values in Europe, is the freedom of any minority religion, whether it be Jewish or anything else, to practice their religion freely. And it was also the lack of debate about really what is kosher slaughter anyway. And it took a long time before people started to realise that kosher slaughter actually is not as bad as people think it is. So to me, there's something sort of deeper going on. And it's got to do with somehow being we don't like anymore in Europe the idea that there is a minority group in any way which is dedicated to its religion. We're seeing even against Christians. We don't like the idea that there are those who are attached to principle, who are attached to doing something which is very deeply based on religion and on a relationship with God. So there's a spiritual dimension to it, I think, which we need to fight against all of these kinds of symptoms of a deeper spiritual vacuum in Europe, which I'm afraid is also being taken by others. You know, the majority now in this area is coming from the other side. It's humanism combined with, you know, the Islamic forces, which I'm afraid are squeezing out the Judeo-Christian ethics in Europe.
If I may add
Sure.
to this topic, in Netherlands, for example, it's a great example. The market in Netherlands for the non-kosher meat is about 454 million animals a year. The most popular way of slaughter in Holland is by shooting the animals before for pre-stunning. According to the statistics, between 10 to 20% of the shooting actually goes wrong, either because the animal moved a little bit, either because the one who shot it moved a little bit. That means that the effect is not done. That means that right after that, the animals are going to be slaughtered, and 10 to 20% are still alive because the stunning didn't go well. You're talking about, if we're talking about only about the 10%, let's say, is about 45 million animals that for sure suffers according to the statistic. While the entire Jewish market in Holland is 3,000 animals that, according to our proofs, does not suffer less than that. So it's a bit again weird. How can you speak about these 3,000 animals that there are so many experts that they have less pain, while you have 45 million animals that for sure suffer. So all these elements bring us to understanding that this is not only about animal welfare here in Europe.
And Joel, you have a word on that. We've got less than 5 minutes of programme.
Yeah, also I wanted to add one perspective on this issue. There is a lot of hypocrisy in this debate, because when those people who are speaking about their concern about animal welfare, I've never heard those same people speaking about frog legs or speaking about lobster. Have you seen how we cook a lobster? We drop the lobster in boiling water. I'm not sure that it's very sympathetic for the lobster being dropped to boiling water, but we don't hear this. And we see that the concern of those people who are fighting for the so-called animal welfare is very selective, and I ask to myself why they are so much focused on the ritual slaughter for Jews and Muslims. And actually, I got the answer for some leaders, political leaders in various European countries, and some of them, at least behind the doors, they were honest, and they said, actually, we are sorry for the Jews, but Jews in this issue is a collateral damage. Is a collateral damage because this law, we are focused on Muslim immigration, and we know that Jews, as Rabbi said, a small minority is eating kosher. Among the Muslim population, the number are very higher, and it's a concern in some country for some populist and some xenophobic parties to see the rising Muslim community, and it's a way for them to fight against the Muslim immigration. And as one very famous European political leader told me, sorry for the Jews, but you are collateral damage.
I'm sorry, this is a real excuse, because the main issue for ritual slaughter is about pre-stunning. Mm-hmm. Most of the Muslims does not have a problem with pre-stunning. So actually the only groups that are immediately affected is the Jewish community, because the Muslims, again, majority of them don't have a problem with pre-stunning. So this law There's no implication for Muslim communities. They can continue with the halal. It's still halal according to the religious. Yeah, okay. Although the Jews are pre-stunning, so we do not buy. We don't buy these excuses.
Concerning. That's even more concerning.
Why always this focus on? Why is this issue coming up time and again?
I would say there's a lot again misunderstanding. There's sometimes groups who are the initiators, but the majority of people just following. They don't know. I met again in the past 2 months over 40 MEPs. Some of them signed a letter to the Commission, which is called the Declaration for Labeling of Kosher Meat. When I spoke with them, I met with most of them. It says, look, you're talking about, again, there's so many problems. If you speak about the rights of the consumer, that they have to know where the meat comes from, so please, you should issue a book with all the history of the cow, about the transportation, about the medicine. You have so many details to add. Many of them said, you know what, I've been asked to sign. I support animal welfare, so I signed. I did not understand what would be the implication.
Yeah. Gentlemen, sadly we're at the end of the programme, so I want to thank you for bringing these issues to light, and particularly, Rabbi, I want to thank you so much for raising awareness of the plight of Jewish kosher food and ritual slaughter, because it's obviously very important, because this is integral to the survival of the Jewish community across Europe, and very much support the excellent work that you're doing, Joel, raising these issues and speaking up on behalf of Israel and the Jewish community across Europe. So thank you for being my guest on today's programme. And Andrew as well. It's a pleasure to have you back on the European Report. And I just want to thank you all for watching today's programme. We have to pray about the situation in the Ukraine and the Crimea, that this doesn't escalate into a further war that could actually threaten European security. But it makes us realise that maybe we take our freedom and liberties for granted, and you know, this is something that we should actually cherish and value, and we should make more of an effort to understand what's happening in the world and to stand with those people who are oppressed, not only in the Middle East but also in Europe as well. And it's important that we secure our values, because our values are based on our Judean Christian heritage. So I want to thank you for watching today's European Report here in the heart of the European Parliament in Brussels.